Hey everybody, welcome to the Create SST launch. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever everybody is. Today's going to be a much shorter event as compared to the last one. If you guys are sort of tuned in, let me just sort of get started here. So a couple of things to go over. You might have heard a little bit of chatter around what Create SST is. In a nutshell, it's a starter, a full stack starter that we've created. Based around everything that SST sort of provides. We spend a bunch of work looking at a lot of different setups, trying to figure out what is the sort of best way to get started with building full stack applications with AWS. So what we'll try and do in the event today, aside from talking about it, is maybe take a step back and look at, why are we building this? What are sort of our goals with this? We'll then do a live demo where we sort of create a new project with Create SST, look at the code base, try and understand what are the sort of different pieces, and actually sort of dive in a little bit. And then we've got a couple of cool things sort of planned. So we've got Tyler from ElectroDB and Michael from Pothos, and we're going to do a couple of interviews with them, just sort of asking them questions about their projects a little bit. And the reason sort of for that obviously is, if you haven't sort of caught this already within our community, it's that we're using some of their projects as a part of the Create SST setup. And then to sort of wrap things up towards the end, we'll talk about what is sort of the vision with Create SST. How does it kind of play with the rest of everything that we have. And then finally, we'll do a little Q&A for your questions. If you're coming up with a few of these throughout the event or throughout the presentation or the demo, make sure to put them in YouTube. I think that's kind of where we're going to coordinate everything. The last time we had done this, we were doing it in a couple of different places. This time around, let's just go with the YouTube stream. So just sort of pop your things in there. At the end, we'll kind of sit down and go through all of them. Or at least the most of them, if we've sort of got time. Yeah, that's about it. It isn't a whole lot. And firstly, I'd like to thank you all for taking some time. I know we've talked about it a little bit, so this is kind of fun and exciting to kind of put it out there finally. Before we get started, a couple of quick, I guess, like housekeeping things on our side. You might have already noticed this again if you're in the community. The first big one being that we moved from Slack to Discord. We'd shared kind of thoughts around why we sort of decided to do that. The biggest reason being that Discord was just sort of much better at managing communities, which is kind of the direction we're going in, whereas Slack was sort of more focused on helping you manage your company or your team. And so that just ended up making a lot of sense for us, and we sort of pulled the trigger on that recently, effectively pretty much last week, I guess. And then the other big one is we renamed. So we've obviously talked about this. We've mentioned this a ton. We used to be called Serverless Stack. The domain used to be called serverless-stack. I think in a few places we used to call ourselves the Serverless Stack Framework. In some other places we were called the Serverless Stack Toolkit. Let's just clean the whole thing up. We're just moving to sst.dev. That's the domain name. Just referring to ourselves as SST, trying to be more consistent with that. There's a little bit of a tweak to the logo, nothing too significant, but again, just consolidating around being called SST as opposed to all the different variations that we had in the past. Yeah, that's about it on my end. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Dax. Dax worked on Create SST, and I'll be back later for the Q&A and to wrap things up.
Cool. Thanks, Jay. All right. So for my part of this presentation, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a story. I think it's helpful to understand how we got to where we are today. So I'm going to share a little bit of a personal story. So my journey with serverless started back in December 2020. So at that point, I'd been an engineer for 8 or so years, I think, at that point. And I was building everything with Kubernetes, with Elixir, containers. I was very comfortable with that, and it felt productive, and it made sense to me. But eventually you kind of get bored and you're looking for a change. So this wasn't like rationally driven, or it wasn't through some like technical need. I just was curious and I wanted to learn something new. And that thing ended up being serverless. So I got pulled into it just, I think, through Twitter. I think I heard a lot more people talking about it. Not really anything in detail, more the high level things that you've probably heard a million times. Why is serverless important? Like, what is the serverless, mindset, or whatever they say? These kind of broad, high level things about why, trying to build everything yourself is one option, but this other extreme option of trying to use as many managed services as possible. If you adopt that, if you buy into that, what are the benefits? Why does it make sense for your technology, for your team, for your product, etc.? So I got pretty pulled in. I really loved everything I was hearing. It really clicked for me, even though I was doing basically the opposite of it for a while. And I was sold. I was like, okay, I want to go all in. I want to spend time like really learning this and really building in this way. So the next thing I did was try to find a bunch of practical examples. I kept searching like real world serverless application or like open source serverless application, and I really didn't find anything. It was pretty hard to like find something cohesive, and it wasn't really that I was looking for something very complete. I just had a like million micro questions. Like, how do I organize my code? Should I put everything into one function? Should I split it up into 10 functions? Should I do something in between? Like, how do I decide that? Where do I put secrets? How do I set up my AWS account? How do I, in that process, I found out, you're supposed to have multiple AWS accounts. So I had like a million of these really small questions. And I knew if I was able to look at a very complete app that's been deployed and maybe still under development, it would probably answer a lot of those, just because you're forced to answer those when you build something. So I spent a lot of time looking for this. I didn't find anything, so I kind of gave up, and I was like, okay, I think I need to just try to build my own thing and step through each part of it and really spend time figuring out for each step what is a really good way of doing things. And of course, there's usually not like a best way. It's more about understanding what are the three options that make sense and which one should you go with for each thing. So I started that process on my own. The first thing that came up was local development. And I think maybe even calling it local development is maybe not the right way to frame it. More just how do you like develop it day to day? How do you develop a serverless application day to day? I think I started doing all this with Terraform, then eventually I tried SAM, and then eventually I found CDK, and CDK made sense to me, but then I wasn't sure how to run this up effectively locally, and that's what led me to SST. So I think SST had launched maybe a couple months before I found it. This is pretty early, and I saw that it solved some of these initial problems that I was looking for. So local development, it has a flow for that out of the box. It had support for deploying to multiple stages. So it was solving some of these very specific problems and giving me options for how to do it. And that's kind of continued to be the case today. If you look at SST today, you have a lot of really good primitives that you can assemble into a full project. But the reality is you still have to do a lot of work in figuring out how to assemble them together. And I'm not talking about just within the SST constructs or within the primitives. It includes your entire project, right? All the other technologies you need to combine to ship a serverless application. So everything from monorepo tools. Like, what is a monorepo? What are the monorepo tools? How should my monorepo look for Node.js? How do I package my functions? Like, what's ESM? What's CJS? And on the AWS side, you still need to figure out what services should I really use, which ones are good, which ones should I avoid. If I want to use this service, does it make sense in the serverless context? There's still a lot to figure out there. And if I really think back at my own journey with this, it took me probably a year and a half to get to a good place with all of this. And that's not a normal year and a half. That's a year and a half of really focusing on just learning serverless and just learning AWS. And I had pretty ridiculous resources, right? I had access to Frank and Jay, who have been building this way for a really long time. I had access to our community where there's a lot of people that have been building this way for a long time, and I was able to see hundreds of projects. And even then, it took me a year and a half probably to get to where I am today. And where I am today isn't really the final state. I think in terms of what I can build and how I'm building, it's pretty good for a V1 of your product. It's not, I don't think I'm done on this path. I think I still have more to go to think about, okay, how do these projects evolve in year 2, year 3, year 4? So it's a lot, and it's kind of what my process has taught me. Most of you do not have time to do this. You're building an actual product at an actual company. If you are trying to sell serverless to your team, it's a hard sell to say, oh yeah, we all need to really dedicate a lot of this time to learning all this and figuring out how to do all this right. And oftentimes, like, it's, you're balancing a bunch of things. You often don't get it right, and we see that doing support where people structured certain things slightly different than what we would recommend, and there's maybe not issues on day one, but issues that eventually come up. But we're in a pretty unique position where we can spend all of our time doing that. That's what we spend every single day doing. Like, every little thing that might just be a minor inconvenience for your team, we can spend a week just trying every option and figuring out, okay, what is the absolute best way to do certain things. And I want to use a specific example. And I think this example was when it clicked for me that, oh, this can be our role for the community. Just really focusing on these details. And that example is with our RDS construct. So when I first joined the ST team, and probably up until like 3 or 4 months ago, I think we did not have an RDS construct. People were using RDS with SST, and we would get support requests around, hey, I'm running into issue X, Y, and Z. I personally was also trying to use RDS in a serverless environment, and it was difficult, right? It's pretty hard. You can't just use RDS, plug in your functions, and expect it to work. There's a bunch of things that come up. So one of the first things we found was, okay, if you're using RDS, that means you need a VPC. Okay, if you're using a VPC, now your functions need to be in a VPC. Okay, if your functions are in a VPC, that means local development is a little weird. And also, you're now paying for something called a managed NAT gateway. And a managed NAT gateway does not scale to 0. So you're paying for it even if you're not using it, which means now all your development environments are now costing a lot more. And we kept unwinding this, and there's just more and more and more complexity around using RDS. If it's in a VPC, you now need to set up a VPN to connect to it and run like debugging queries or checking things in production. So this was a huge pain point. So we started to really unwind this and think about, okay, how can we make this easier? So we figured out that, okay, RDS has something called the data API, and the data API is a way to run queries against RDS through HTTP and secured by IAM. So that fixes the first problem of, okay, if you spin up RDS with data API, your Lambda functions no longer need to be in a VPN or need to be in the VPC. Okay, that's great. The next immediate problem is a lot of the great tooling that's out there for talking to a database does not support data API. I think initially I was trying to get Prisma to work with that. It didn't work, and their architecture makes it so it's unlikely it'll ever work. So we're like, okay, we can't use Prisma. And we tried a few of the other options. It wasn't great. And one day, through a lucky Google search, I found this project called Kaisley, which I actually recently found in their Discord. They were talking about the actual pronunciation of it. So I'm definitely mispronouncing it, but I haven't memorized the right way to say it yet. So I'm going to continue mispronouncing it. So we found Kaisley, which is a really great type-safe query builder. We built an integration with that and data API. And that finally made it so using Lambda with RDS, you can get a type-safe query builder without a VPC. And that started to solve it more. And then we started to add functionality in our console to directly talk to RDS to the data API. So you don't need to set up like a VPN with some other SQL client. So this was a full end-to-end thing of really reworking how people were using RDS. And we baked all that into our construct. And the thing to note here is we didn't build all of it. A lot of this was going out and trying a bunch of the great tools that are out there and identifying the best one and bringing that in and making it so it works really smoothly with SST without all the rough edges. And that's kind of the direction we want to go in. And that's why today we're launching Create SST. I think it's our first official step into saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to spend a lot of time in these little micro problems, maybe build some stuff, maybe find some really great projects, make it all work together and connect all the dots. And this is our first step into saying this is part of our responsibility. We want to give you not only primitives, we're going to continue delivering primitives. The way we build, it's always going to be building low-level tools first, but we also need to deliver a standard framework for using these primitives together. If you're an expert, which many of you are, a lot of what I've learned from our community has been from the experts in our community, you can ignore Create SST. You can continue to assemble your own setup that's optimized for your expertise and the way your team wants to build things. But we also need to make sure that for someone new coming in, there is a really excellent starting point that's not the place I started back in December. People talk about, why isn't serverless bigger? It feels big because maybe we're in the space and it seems like a lot of people are building this way. But in the grand scheme of things, it's tiny. And I think for me, the reason is, if you look at other options like Rails or Phoenix or even like Next.js, you can get started, know nothing, build a full stack application in a week and maybe even ship it. Serverless is nowhere close to that yet. We're probably, like I said, I feel like it took me a year and a half. Maybe like it's kind of setting the bar too high, but even at minimum, it's going to take you several months to really learn how to do this well. We need to bring that down to make it comparable to these other options if we really want serverless to become mainstream. So with that, with Create SST, this is really just the beginning of what we're launching. I think we got to a place where it makes sense for people to start projects on, but it's like really just the beginning. And our first area of focus is GraphQL. We've learned from a lot of setups that people have had in our community, and we've kind of stepped through every possible way we could find of doing GraphQL in AWS. We went through a lot of iterations. We tried AppSync, we tried Apollo, tried GraphQL CodeGen. We've experimented with all of the front-end GraphQL clients to figure out, okay, which one really makes sense. And we've arrived at something we think is pretty good, and that's what we're sharing with you all today. Again, like this is really a starting point. You might disagree with some of these decisions. You might say, hey, I like some of what you did, but I really want to use AppSync. You can continue to do that. This is really just an example of, hey, here's a nice developer experience that we've been able to put together. Maybe you can learn from it, take it as is, or tweak it as you see fit. And not only are we launching Create SST today, which is a starter, we're also launching a new Learn Guide. So if you go to docs.sst.dev right now, there is a new Learn Guide that's oriented around Create SST. If you watched our previous conference and you saw my talk in it, it's kind of based off of that talk. It's kind of going through similar steps, but a little more in detail. We've not only go through the steps of adding a new feature to this setup and how it all works, but also some higher level, more like philosophical things, like why did we separate folder structures in a certain way? Like how should you think about organizing your code? Things like that. It's all just things I wish I had when I was first learning serverless. And we have a lot more coming up. So that Learn Guide I think that structure is not going to change, but we're going to start adding more chapters as we have more stuff that we're deploying. So the next thing we're going to work on is auth. I think I was telling the team, I think almost every single day I answer one question about someone finding it frustrating to use Cognito. So it's a huge pain point, and we have a lot of clarity on what we want to do. Now it's just, we're going to go out and do it. Secrets, this is another thing where I think everyone stores their configuration and secrets in a dozen different ways. Testing is huge, and I don't think we have really great examples of like full integration tests that make sense for serverless environments. And we're going to keep going. The way we've been operating is we're kind of pretending like we're building our own company, and okay, what does our company need now? Like now that we've had our first MVP, okay, we need to maybe do better testing, and we're going to figure out testing. We're even going to get into things like data pipelines, right? How do you have your main application that does your day-to-day stuff, but syncing that data into somewhere to let your team do analytics on it? We're going to go pretty deep with the areas of your company that we have answers for, and that's another thing that I hope separates us from the other options. we're not just an application framework. We are, by nature of our team and our experience, we've built companies before, we built a lot of products before, and we really want to encode that knowledge and expertise into our actual framework, and that's going to touch a lot of things. So, okay, so that's my kind of initial spiel. I think we can get to some of the more interesting parts now, which is a screen share of actually using Create SST and stepping through some of what it comes with. So let me switch to my screen share. All right, I think that looks good. All right, cool. So we have a new, it's actually the same command you've been using. We've just tweaked what the default behavior is. So npx create SST. So if you run this, it now asks you, it puts you in the flow of our default setup. The only options we have in there right now are picking between the databases, whether you want to use RDS, which is Postgres or MySQL, or if you want to use DynamoDB. These aren't permanent decisions when you're creating the starter. You can actually pick one and then just use both if you want, or you can switch it later. I personally have switched databases several times in my projects, and the structure that we have set up makes it fairly easy to do so. So let's pick DynamoDB since I demoed RDS last time. And let's call it Scratch as a project name. So this will bootstrap your project. This is also going to include a React front end. And this is what we have right now. We're automatically creating that for you. If you don't want to use a React single page application and it's done with Vite, which is what we recommend, if you don't want to use that, you can delete that and set up Next.js. You can set up Remix. You can set up Solid, like whatever else you want to use, you can swap that out. Our goal over time is to ask a second question here on Create SST so that we can ask you what front end do you want to use. You want to use Next.js, Remix, etc. And we want to make sure we have really great default setups that plug nicely into your backend. So let's explore what shows up here. All right, make the screen a little bit bigger. Size this. Okay. So let's just step through this one by one. I need to pull up my notes here so I don't miss anything. All right. Okay. So let's start with the stacks folder. And this is going to be the most familiar because this is just the core of SST, which are our constructs. So nothing too different than what you'd expect. It has a standard entry point. It'll set your default to node 16. It sets your source path to services, which I'll explain in a little bit what that is. But the thing that's a little bit different here is we're setting up a few stacks for you automatically. So we're setting up a database stack, an API stack, and a web stack. So if you look at our database stack, I forgot to, let me just run yarn really quick so that, and these are installed. While it's running, I'll keep going. So looking at the database stack, because we chose a DynamoDB example, we have a DynamoDB table that is set up for you automatically. So one of the things we set up for you here is some of the fields. And this is a question we've gotten a bunch of times. What should my DynamoDB table structure look like? So what we've set up for you automatically here is a schema for single table design. We think most products, it makes sense to start off with a single table that's following single table design. If you don't know what that is, if you look in our Learn guide, we have a bunch of references for you to understand what that is. But effectively what we have here is a table set up for a really basic single table design situation and with like a single index on it. You don't really have to know too much about what that is. I'll show you later in the services folder how we actually use this. So the next thing we have is our API stack. So if you look at our API stack, it has a single API gateway, some defaults for permissions for all the functions in here to access the database. It'll pass through the table name so your functions can access it. And it'll have a single GraphQL route. And this is a new route type we have, and it's powered by Pothos, which I'll show in a second. And then, it sets up your function handler as well. And there's a few other things here that it does for you automatically. It sets up a bunch of code generation things. So this is really what powers the end-to-end type safety, which is one of the things that we're definitely optimizing for. We want to make sure you can define things in one place and have them inferred in all the places where you need it. So in this case, we have automatically set up GenQL, which is a client we're using for GraphQL on the front end, at least for the code gen part. And we're also specifying where we're going to dump out our schema. And then we have our final stack, which is our web stack. So this stack just sets up a static site, a Vite static site. And this is what we'll use to deploy your front end. You can see that it passes through some environment variables for the API, so your front end can automatically talk to the API that's deployed. So the stacks stuff, pretty simple: database, API, front end. Of course, you can reorganize this. You can add more stuff. It's really just a starting point. So the next thing is a services folder. So the services folder effectively will contain all of your code that's powering your functions. So all of your backend services that you're going to rely on. And this is split up into two folders here. This actually shouldn't be there. I need to fix that. So you have your core, which is all your core business logic. The stuff in here is not really related to functions or anything serverless specific. It's or Lambda specific. It's really just your core logic. And if you look at my previous talk, I kind of go in and explain some of that in detail. Also, our Learn Guide covers this as well. And this gets bootstrapped with a Dynamo module. And what we have here set up for you automatically is a setup with ElectroDB. So this is kind of what I was saying earlier. A lot of what we are doing is identifying really great libraries out there and integrating that with SST. I've tried every single Dynamo library out there. I've tried DynamoDB Toolbox. I've tried One Table. I've tried the straight, just like AWS SDK Dynamo setup. And then I tried ElectroDB, and through that process, I found that ElectroDB is really the best option in terms of best developer experience. It's really well thought through API. I feel like I learned how to use Dynamo more just from using the library, and I've had a great experience with it compared to everything else I've tried. And that's what we set up for you automatically. We set up a basic configuration for ElectroDB. And this starter isn't like a completely empty starter. We do have like a little bit of a basic application in here. It's not going to be too much for you to delete because you're unlikely. The example application is like a simple like article site that lists articles. It's unlikely that's going to be helpful for your application, but it is good as an example, and it's easy to remove. And so we have this article domain. We create this article entity. This is a DynamoDB, or rather it's an ElectroDB entity, and it manages saving this in a correct format into that single table schema that I showed earlier. It's very nice and easy to use. You just specify all your fields, you specify their type, if they're required, read-only, etc. You can specify some of your indexes as well, and then you get a fully type-safe client to now talk to it. So if I go here and I do article entity create, it's going to know what fields are required, and it's going to require that I put those. You can have key conditions here, and this, I don't remember the exact format. I might have it backwards. Yeah, so you can say things like create. It doesn't really make create it where maybe create isn't the best example. Let's say we create it where I'm going to make something up. So I'm kind of forgetting how to use this. I probably am not going to demo this. It's all in the Learn Guide. We can kind of go through there and see. Okay, cool. So basically, we have a create function, a list function, pretty simple, and then we have the functions folder. So now this is where all of your serverless functions, your Lambda functions, will actually go. In this setup, we really only have one, which is your GraphQL function. But over time, you're going to have more stuff here: cron jobs, event handlers, things like that. So if you look into this folder, we have a pretty basic handler. It's using create GraphQL handler. And this is coming from a library that we're shipping. This is a Lambda optimized handler. If you watch my function bundling video, I kind of go through the reasons why we needed to really spend time creating a Lambda optimized handler. This is minimized cold starts compared to all the other options. It's the fastest cold starting GraphQL server that we've been able to find / create. And it still retains a lot of the functionality you need. And then we have this types folder, which actually contains your GraphQL types and your schema. And this is using the library I mentioned earlier, Pothos, and we have the creator coming on later to talk to us about it. Again, this came as a result of exploring all the different ways to do GraphQL on the back end, specifying a schema, and then code-genning the TypeScript, or specifying it all in TypeScript, and then code-genning the schema. We tried every combination. This is the one that we found was the most helpful. Our Learn Guide covers how to use this in detail. It also links to the Pothos documentation to kind of go deep. It supports all kinds of cool plugins. It has really great TypeScript support, lots of really awesome inference abilities. If you look at ElectroDB and Pothos, they're very similar in the way they've approached the type safety side of things. So yeah, so we have that set up for you automatically. And I think that is it in terms of what's in the backend side of things. So the last folder we have is the web folder. So this is the front end that we bootstrap for you automatically. So this is a standard React application. It was created with Vite. Again, Vite is another one of those tools where if you're building it, we've gone out, tried all the options. If you're building a front-end application today, it should be built on top of Vite, which is a really great dev server that's super fast for local development, bundles everything effectively for production. So you might ask, like, okay, what did you do besides just set up, like, clone the Vite starter for React? We've also set up automatically all the code gen to talk to your GraphQL API. And that's here. Again, you don't really have to look into any of this. It's all created for you automatically, but it's what powers this type safe querying. So you can, if you change anything in our backend, your SST start will automatically run the code gen, and all this will be updated in real time. Again, you can look at my other talk to see a full demo of that. The type safety here is great if you're querying. So here I'm saying I want to fetch articles and I want to fetch these 3 fields. If I remove one of them, you will get proper type safety. You see only one is available. If I add those back, you get instant feedback on all 3. So there's no code gen steps here as you work. It's all immediate and reactive. So that's one of the things we optimize for. We know code gen is we can't avoid it to some degree. You have to code generate it, but we want to minimize where it's needed. But also those code gen steps, we want to have those trigger automatically. So when you're working on things, you shouldn't feel like, okay, now I need to go run a code gen step, or I need to wait for a code gen step to happen. It all happens automatically, and it's really fast. And for the most part, you don't really notice it. And that kind of speaks to, we haven't invented any of these things. These are all things that are out there, but we just kind of put them together in a way and smooth over the rough edges. Cool. So it's the front end. And I think that's everything. So we also have in here like a V-test setup. This is another project that we discovered that we love. It's more or less a drop-in for Jest. It is way faster. You don't need any plugins. You don't need any complex configuration. Using modern JavaScript with Jest can be a nightmare. V-test solves that for you really nicely. We don't have really great examples of integration tests in here yet, but like I mentioned earlier, that is something that'll be coming soon. And yeah, so I think that is everything in here. So I encourage you to go and run this and poke around yourself. I'm sure you're going to find some issues that we're looking forward to fixing. And yeah, this is just the beginning. We're going to continuously be adding to this. One of the challenges is if you start a project on this and we make upgrades to it, it won't be as easy as just updating SST, but we're going to be providing really great migration guides to adopt new things. So if we put out an auth construct, we're going to show you, okay, if you already have an existing application, here's how you now switch over to our auth construct, things like that. So there's a lot of benefit into adopting this because it's going to continue to improve. And you can swap out whatever you don't like and whatever you disagree with. And this is just our flavor of what we think makes sense for, you know, most companies. And cool. So let me switch off this. All right. So now that's kind of ends the demo portion of this. And I think, as you guys saw, I highlighted a lot of really great projects that are part of Create SST. I think the most impressive parts of this we didn't build, so we wanted to have some of the authors of those projects on to talk about, you know, themselves and the project. So first up, we have Tyler, and Tyler's a creator of ElectroDB, which is a DynamoDB client that I showed. So let me bring him on. So everyone say hi to Tyler. How's it going? Let me unmute you. Wait, hang on. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Are you good?
Oh, there you go. Okay, I can hear you. How's it going?
Good. What's up, man? We've been chatting a bit. We've never met. I'm super excited to meet you finally and talk about DynamoDB.
Yeah, same here. So me and Tyler have been talking for a while. It's been a few months now. Only on Slack. It's our first time interacting. Where are you joining us from, by the way?
Atlanta.
Atlanta. Nice. Cool. Is that where you are all the time? Nice. Cool. Awesome. So yeah, let's get started. Let's talk about ElectroDB. So yeah, I'd love to hear about what the inspiration for ElectroDB was. Like what kind of led you to deciding to create your own thing?
Yeah. So I went to reInvent 2018, and I actually saw Rick Uland's speech that is kind of now passed around as one of the pivotal speeches or talks to see. If you haven't checked it out, for single table design, it's everything clicked with me after seeing that talk. Yeah. I think he gave a couple, but to me that one's pretty quintessential. And at the time I was working on this online banking portal project, and I was building the transaction warehouse. So that's for members' accounts and transactions that they make with purchases and everything else. And after seeing that talk, I'm like, oh man, this is perfect for DynamoDB. And then when I went to go implement it, I was just like, oh, like this is difficult to implement in a way that's readable. Like, you know, and then also the other, you know, I was the only one who had saw that talk. So there was a lot of people on the team who didn't really it didn't click with them necessarily how you might kind of do single table. And so I started, you know, I think a lot of people when they're building this, they end up kind of building their own little utility functions and things like that. And you kind of build this makeshift kind of thing. And I started using it in side projects. DynamoDB in side projects. And I started procrastinating one day because I'm like, there's got to be a better way to like encapsulate all this stuff into some sort of API. And so I procrastinated from the main project and then spent like a year or so working on ElectroDB. And then now it's been much longer than a year now. I want to say it's like 2 years of just kind of maintaining it. I introduced it to the projects that I was working on, both professionally and personally, and it's been so helpful in just kind of standing stuff up quickly.
Yeah, it's awesome. I guess, I mean, you've been working on it for a while, but did you try out? I don't know if they were around back when you were looking, but did you try out some of the other options that were there?
I did. I started kind of, and maybe it's probably some level of ego or something. I didn't even look really to see if there were other options. I'm just like, I know what I want to build.
Yeah, nice.
I have this thing in my head. When I got deeper into it, some coworkers were like, hey, have you checked out, you know, I think DynamoDB Toolbox was one that was definitely around at the time. And I felt like the other options I was looking at really exposed a lot of the underpinnings of DynamoDB, and the parts that clicked for me in kind of like understanding how you build keys, because that's ultimately, I think, what the hardest part is all the caveats, the string manipulation. It was thinking about it in terms of, you know, I have a relational database background that, you know, even when you're building indexes there, you think about the order in which those indexes are built. I'm like, why can't we take from that and just kind of let somebody deal with and work with just kind of the attributes that they actually want, get away from key building completely, you know, but enforce through constraints that they provide what they need to. And so that's kind of why I focused it on my own project as opposed to going with another.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, and this is one of the things we think about with SST as well. There's a lot of things that you might not know in the beginning, and you're kind of screwed later when you find out about it, right? So I think one of the nice things about ElectroDB is it builds versioning into the keys. I think when you're first doing Dynamo, you probably don't think to do that. If you don't think to do that and you realize later you need it, it's pretty painful to introduce that. So that's one of the things that is challenging about AWS. It's really powerful, but you need to, there's things you kind of need to know ahead of time, and we want to bake as much of that into our frameworks and our tooling as possible. So you're getting it automatically without knowing about it, and then later you just kind of benefit when you realize how it's working.
Yeah, I think DynamoDB is kind of the king of that, of not really, or just allowing you to shoot yourself in the foot until you get to a certain size, and then you realize, oh crap, like now you got a massive refactor of certain things. And I think DynamoDB gets a lot of crap where it's like, oh, you got to focus on your access patterns early. Personally, I think you don't necessarily have to do that more than a relational database. You have to know your domain just as much. The difference with DynamoDB is if you need to update a schema or things like this, it's all scripting. It's not built into DynamoDB to help you migrate. And so it becomes, that's why it's so important. And it's so easy to miss. You mentioned versioning, but also just kind of having delimiters between your key attributes and these other things that you get to a certain scale size, and now you're having throughput issues or these other things that you just didn't have before.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, on that topic, so you mentioned you watched the talk in person. Did everything click for you right away, or did you have to like go and spend time learning it? Like, how did you actually become an expert in how to do single table?
At the time there wasn't too many resources on it. I think that was what made it difficult to kind of understand it up until that point. Actually, around the time where I made kind of my first kind of public releases of ElectroDB, Alex Dupree's book came out, and I read through that book and I was like, oh, thank God, like I thought about this correctly.
Yeah.
So, that was useful to see that. I actually messaged him. It was like right before his book came out. I'm like, hey, like, can you take a look at this? And he said like, sure, whatever. He never got back to me because his book blew up. So it's definitely useful to look through that. And it was very validating at the time too, because I had spent so much time on thinking about these things. And so I think now there's a whole wealth of information about these types of things. And it's almost overwhelming now. It's on the overwhelming side, I feel like at times. And a lot of it was just sitting down at a desk and trying to think through these types of things and thinking about hierarchical order and stuff like that. It helps to have an example in front of you for sure, to then kind of think about that or a problem to solve, I'd say.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I was lucky in that I think I found it when there were more resources. I think, if I remember correct, I think I watched one of the Rick Houlihan demos where he's like modeling an order system or something in Dynamo, and I got Alex's book as well. In complete honesty, I didn't finish it. I read like 30% of it, and I was like, okay, this all makes sense, but it's like you said, like when you don't have a practical example, it's kind of hard to hold it all in your head. And then I found DynamoDB Toolbox, and I feel like that kind of taught me. And then I found ElectroDB, and I feel like, okay, that like just by using the library, you kind of learn over time. So I'm really excited about it, because one of the challenges we had when deciding with Create SST, DynamoDB is a great experience for serverless architectures. Like once you know how to use it, it's awesome, and you love having it there. But it's a little intimidating up front to learn it, because it's very different from a lot of other things people are used to. But having a really solid library in there that kind of teaches you made us a lot more confident to ship it as part of the starter. Cool. So the other thing that is also really interesting about ElectroDB is it's very TypeScript oriented. Like the whole API around it is not just a normal JavaScript API. It's like very designed to make it use TypeScript as much as possible. So like, what was your journey with TypeScript? Like, how did that all click for you, like to like maximize inference and do all of that stuff?
Yeah, I started using TypeScript a couple of years ago, and more seriously in the last couple of years. It seemed like it was the way the industry was going, and it's been the best bet I've ever made of just sinking a lot of time into that. When it comes to type inference, when I first started trying to do any of that stuff, it was a very similar case where there just wasn't really a lot of documentation on advanced typing. You could find some stuff on generics, but you'd open up, there was projects out there that were doing some crazy stuff, but it's like, how does that even work? And I just couldn't find anything that really kind of broke it down. And again, now there's tons of resources on that thing, but that stuff. But it's still, even to an extent, feels like you're kind of hitting your head against the wall and just trying alterations on things and making it work. It's definitely been a challenge, but I think the strong typing, especially for a data access, for your data access layers or interacting with databases, just becomes so critical and can't just be the basic user managing, certain types or passing these generics in. The inference really is becomes so important when it comes to how quickly somebody can pick up your app and utilize it, and using IntelliSense. I mean, when you're deep in TypeScript, that's like jet fuel for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I think I definitely had a similar experience where, and even to this day, I don't know how to teach like the crazy stuff that TypeScript can do. It's like really hard to even explain. Like it's tough, and I still don't think there's many resources around that. And yeah, it was the same thing. I think you just need to see that, oh, there's this library that's doing this crazy thing, to know that, oh, X is even possible. And once you know it's possible, then you try to like recreate it, and then things slowly kind of click together. I think we went through this phase where pre 1.0 SST, we weren't really using TypeScript in that way. And I think it started to click for the team, and now we're really thinking about our APIs and how do we make sure things are type safe and maximize what TypeScript can do. Cool. So I think those are really all the questions that I had. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been awesome to have you in the community, and I'm sure you see me recommending ElectroDB to everyone that asks.
Yeah, I gotta buy you some beer or flowers, whatever you like. I go on Slack and I'm like, oh man, this guy's like a real G. He's doing good on this. I want stuff like SST to really thrive, because it's probably one of the most exciting things that's coming, that's happening right now, is this revolution of just being able to really stand things up super quickly. Like, for instance, you mentioned data pipelines for SST in the intro. I want to hear nothing more than like what that's all about, because that sounds super exciting. I don't know anything else that's really offering stuff like that, but I have that need. I just can't stand it up, quite as fast as I want to for even my personal projects. So
yeah, exactly. It's something that everyone eventually needs, and usually people end up hiring some kind of consultant to set it up for them. And yeah, it's the kind of stuff we want to start to cover. Yeah, cool. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
All right, next up, we've got Michael. So Michael is a creator of Pothos, which is the GraphQL library that we are using. So everyone, welcome Michael. Hey, how are you doing?
Hey, good to be here. Doing well.
Where are you joining us from, Michael?
I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, nice. Cool. I visited Portland probably a year ago. Had a good time, a lot of good food.
Yep. Food is great here.
Yeah. So first question for you, how do you pronounce Pothos? Am I saying it right? We get this question a lot.
Pothos is what I say.
Pothos.
It's based on the name of a specific plant that we have several of in my house.
Nice. Is that one of ones in your background?
Let's see. It's the one over there above the TV, kind of long and viney.
Nice. Very cool. That is really nice. You got a lot of plants. Okay, well, Pothos. Okay, we'll try to remember that. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about what the inspiration for Pothos was. Like, what was your journey in deciding to build it? Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, definitely. So it was something I first started working on several years ago when I was working at Airbnb. One of the huge inspirations here for this was Nexus. I think a lot of people are probably pretty familiar with Nexus and the work that Tim Greiser was doing on that. We unfortunately were not able to use Nexus in the project we were working on. I think the code generation step there was not compatible with kind of the development environment we had there. So it was initially, a lot of the idea was to try to create a similar developer experience to what was available in Nexus without that code generation step. From there, it's kind of evolved a lot, and kind of to focus on having great type safety and kind of develop a plugin ecosystem. Kind of a lot of the core concepts were around making things very extensible. The big issue we were running into at the time was that we were using a schema first approach initially, and we ended up defining our types in our GraphQL schema, basically replicating that entire structure in our resolvers, and then replicating again in our authorization logic. And then we had a third place where we basically had the same structure for basically annotating the metadata about what information was actually in the schema relating to what was PII and had to be processed in slightly different ways. So we wanted to create a single clean API where you could co-locate all of those things in kind of a single inline definition. And that was the main inspiration for building this out. Nice.
Yeah, I think in one of our iterations we tried to do it with Nexus as well, and the code generation step also was just to order certain things needed to happen in it. It wasn't working for us. Cool. So, I mean, can you expand a little more on the code first versus schema first? How do you think about that now, especially if you had experience with both? Do you kind of see them as equivalent options? Do you feel like one is generally better?
Yeah, I think they're both decent options depending on what your kind of priorities are. But so the schema file, I think, is always an important part of kind of the thing you're creating. But in a code first world, you can have that as an output, and if you have it checked into your source control, which I almost always do, you see that you can still see it in your git diff, and it's something that can be easily reviewed as it iterates. But by having it just be a generated artifact, you're not kind of duplicating the effort of manually defining those things. There's also certain things like connections, for example, where kind of retyping out these very formulaic specific types can get kind of tedious and can also be a little bit error prone, where you want to make sure that you don't accidentally have some of your connection edges be nullable while other ones aren't, or something like that, where there's it's easy to forget something or have some of your connections work just a little bit different than the other ones. And by making more of those kind of patterns code first, you end up having more consistency in the APIs you're developing. That's one of the big things. I think the other thing is just the developer experience, instant feedback you get when you're working with a well-typed library, where you get kind of autocomplete throughout that whole process. And yeah, the GraphQL tooling is coming along, but it's just not quite as clean a developer experience if you're kind of jumping back and forth between multiple files. If there's a very, very specific schema you're building, it can make sense, write out the exact schema you want and then generate some types for it and then go implement it, and that can work. But in my experience, I really enjoy the code first flow.
Yeah, I think the connection example is a great one, because I'm pretty sure I never implemented connections correctly until I used the connection plugin in Pothos, because yeah, it is really tedious and verbose. And it does remind me a lot of, so in SST, we have infrastructure as code. And the other options that people are used to are maybe defining a YAML file, or something more kind of similar to the GraphQL file. It's a declarative thing. And there's nice benefits to that, because it looks the same no matter who wrote it, because it's very limited. But it's the same thing that you're saying, where when you have more complicated things and certain patterns, it's hard to encode those patterns in just a config-based system. You end up having to manually retype stuff. Very easy to miss things. A lot of the reasons why people like infrastructure as code. So I think I'm curious about is TypeScript. So how did you get into TypeScript? Obviously, you are an expert given how well Pothos does at inference. Was that just kind of something that naturally that came up, or when did it all click for you?
Yeah, I had been using it for a little bit before I started working on Pothos. I think I think my TypeScript kind of knowledge and experience evolved very much alongside kind of building that out. It's went through a lot of big iterations. Some of the early versions look very, very different than kind of what's available today. Hopefully it's gotten a lot better. But yeah, so I think having to build out a library like Pothos, you really have to kind of explore what's possible in the type system, because there's a lot of weird, interesting edge cases that you kind of run into. And I don't think that's something you can learn just by reading about it. You really have to dive into a problem space where you have those issues that you have to overcome. I think TypeScript is great and that everyone should be using it for their in their applications. But I also really believe that the complexity and like the hard parts of TypeScript should be abstracted away by libraries. So if you're using libraries like Pothos or some of these like Prismas or other really type safe database clients, your application code ends up having very few type definitions, and everything should be type safe without people writing applications having to do a lot of that complex work. And then the libraries can kind of encode a lot of those weird transforms that are happening and kind of doing the complex inference checks and stuff. And that's kind of, I love that duality of TypeScript where you can give people great type safety, autocomplete, all of that, and give people confidence without them having to understand that. But then if you are on the other side of it, you can really dive into the types and do some really crazy things that enable awesome features.
Yeah, I think about it in a very similar way. I think a lot of the crazy features in TypeScript are for library authors, and you learn them writing a library, but they're mostly there so you can give a really great experience to the end users. I think when you're using libraries that take advantage of all that, the end user is not really writing TypeScript. Most of their code just looks like normal JavaScript, maybe a few type annotations here and there. But if things are designed well, you really shouldn't have to be writing too many of your own types. And I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions I see when people are hesitant in using TypeScript, because they think it means, all this extra stuff they're doing, when it's done right, it's actually less stuff with a lot more safety. Cool. So last question, Pothos in the future, like what are you excited for? Other, general plans you have? What kind of stuff are you looking forward into getting into?
Yeah, I think there's lots of little features and things that can still be improved. And those I'll continue to tackle as kind of issues come up. I think bigger things, there are some interesting plugins left to build. It's a very big ecosystem. I think integration with more data sources is a big one. I think there's a lot of improvements to be made around kind of validation. There's some interesting things coming up in GraphQL specs. For example, like the one of kind of annotation, so that you can have something analogic, something similar to unions for your input types. That's a really popular question that I get. The Prisma plugin is one of the kind of most one of the features people are most interested in, and there's a lot of work to do there. I think everyone wants the basically just to get everything out of the box from Prisma, and I think there's a very interesting line to walk there between I don't want to auto-generate anything, and I want to kind of continue to have this feel of you're building exactly the schema you want, and we're not going to like automatically create types for you from your database, but kind of making the process of defining the like input types and filters and queries and things easier, so that it's not such a so complicated if you want to define like some complicated like nested string filters with ands and ors and things that people might want for their if they have like a complicated paginated table that has a bunch of different options on it. There are some things I can hopefully will be able to do to make that a little bit easier.
Cool. Yeah, all very exciting. Awesome. So I think that's all the questions that I had. So again, thank you for joining us today. Obviously, we're huge fans. Yeah, we're huge fans of Pothos. We want to get a lot more people using it, and hopefully we're able to do that.
yeah, looking forward to hearing how things go, and hopefully building some cool features based on the feedback you get.
Yeah, cool. All right, have a good rest of your day, Michael.
Thank you very much.
All right, so those are all the interviews we had today. So I'm going to kick it back over to Jay for the rest of the event.
Yeah, welcome back, guys. Let me, before I get into some of the things that I had sort of planned here, let me just sort of give a quick reminder to everybody. I see a couple of questions in YouTube. Again, we'll be doing a little bit of a Q&A right at the end. So if you've got any questions, again, I see you want sort of related to TypeScript, but anything that you can sort of think of that's sort of SST related, create SST related, whatever you might have, just sort of pop them in there. We'll go through them after. While you guys are doing that, what I wanted to kind of talk about was, like one of the questions you might have looking at the create SST stuff that we talked about today is, fundamentally, what is sort of create SST and how does it kind of play with the rest of SST? Are they like two separate things? Is it that create SST is the only way that I can use SST sort of moving forward, or are you guys still working on SST, things like that? But to sort of think about this as a concept, Dax kind of talked about one of the issues that we had faced early on with working on SST was that we're giving you all these primitives, but then and those primitives are obviously sort of specific to these the constructs or the sort of services that you're using. But one of the issues is that when you're building a full stack application, you have to kind of plug together not just the constructs themselves or these primitives themselves, but you have to also think about the rest of the ecosystem and the sort of design choices or the technology choices that you need to make to build out your entire application. And so fundamentally we had to address that issue. And what that really meant was that when a person that was sort of new to both serverless or SST, when they sort of came in, they would have to go through this process. And the best way we could think about sort of fixing that was basically create SST. Is that here's this opinionated set of things that is almost the sort of entry point to how you build your serverless applications with SST. And it's the kind of the sort of like we're calling sort of the meta framework, which is sort of the wrapper around all of the primitives that we have and this all the sort of the other ecosystem of technologies that we're sort of choosing from. And the key thing that I kind of want to make clear is that it's not so much so that, hey, this is the only way to build an application with SST. It is a way that we have spent time investigating and trying to figure out, essentially just sort of answer some of our own questions, but also answer the questions of like what we get in the community and what we think would make sense. Again, SST has been around for a little over a year now, and there are a bunch of different setups that people have. Even just sort of like thinking back to, when we first sort of started working on it, like the guide that we have that lets you, that helps you sort of build like a notes application that uses a slightly different setup, a very simplified setup. But there are going to be a bunch of different setups that people are going to come up with. And I think, in the chat, I sort of mentioned, I saw the mention from Misha on the setup that he has, and he's got sort of a Prisma specific setup. There are a bunch of different ones. So you're going to have these sort of, it's almost like these like little toolkits or little starters that you're going to put together that you would want to have it in a way that you can easily sort of replicate. This is our version of that. And again, I think Dax sort of made a good point on the fact that like create SST, especially this sort of event and what we're putting out today is a starting point for that sort of journey from our perspective. So given that context, now you can kind of think about, all right, we've got SST, which is sort of all the constructs and the primitives, and you can kind of think about, the updates that we're sort of releasing and the sort of versioning that goes with it, in terms of just the pure sort of release schedule. And then on the other side, we've got the same sort of thing for create SST. Create SST is it's like an npm package. that helps you stand up a full stack application based on, again, the things that we talked about today. And that'll have a set of like its own sort of versioning as it kind of goes along. There's a little bit of a difference in that, and again, sort of Dax sort of touched on this. It's not as straightforward when we roll out sort of updates to create SSD. You know, we would have to have again, this is very specific to the types of upgrades that we make or updates that we make to create SSD. But for some cases, it might just be, hey, look, if you're using, you know, this construct in this specific way based on the previous version of create SSD, this is the sort of set of changes that you would need to make, and it might just be like changes to your code. You know, we might invest in code mods later on, as you've sort of seen in other communities or other projects. Again, that's something that sort of needs to be figured out on our side. But fundamentally, you know, here's a bunch of primitives. Here's our take on how on a good way to kind of put them together. Plus, you know, as we've investigated in the rest of the ecosystem, here are some of the projects that we really like, that really made sense for us, that we would use ourselves. And spoiler alert, but in the future, we are going to use ourselves and kind of open source some of that as well. But that would be create SSD. And then both of these sort of side to side have their own sort of versions. I'm laughing at the mullet comment, but they'll have their own sort of versions and sort of releases as it kind of goes along. And yeah, so that's the way we kind of think about it. For the folks, a special shout out to all the folks that have been with us for the last, you know, sort of year plus here, that have built out their own setups. Again, SSD is not fundamentally changing in any way. It is just that we're trying to put together this the sort of opinionated starter that we would want to build and support. And we're probably going to have a few different sort of versions or flavors of this. So, you know, we already have the Postgres, the DynamoDB one. We're probably going to have some specific ones based on some of the front ends that you have, and again, some other sort of use cases that sort of Dax touched on as well. But yeah, fundamentally, that's the way we kind of want to think about these two things. Before we sort of get into the Q&A bit here, one final little bit that I kind of wanted to touch on, and this is maybe a little bit unrelated, but sort of worth sharing as well. You know, we've been doing a few of these streams of these events. You know, Dax has been doing sort of his weekly streams as well. You guys are, you know, in the community, you're getting to see more and more of us as a team, and there's some fun questions that we get here and there about us. But I did want to share a little bit about you know, kind of how we work. We're a very small team. A lot of times when you're in our community, when you're asking us questions, or, you know, you're sort of like interacting with us in any way, shape, or form, it might literally feel like it's just one guy, or, you know, in this case, it's like 3 people, just like running around doing the exact, you know, like doing all the different sort of roles. So like if you were to ask us like a support question, it's like one person. You go along and it's like, oh, the person that implements is probably the same person. The person that releases is probably the same person as well. The person that's tweeting it out finally is again probably the same person as well. It just feels like it's the same person, just like putting on a different hat every single time. And that's fundamentally by design. We're to be completely sort of candid or sort of open about this, we're trying to investigate or at least experiment with a different way of building a company, in that instead of thinking about sort of specializing roles, we want to think about what it would be like if we had just people that were fundamentally just really good at building products, and giving them just complete autonomy and control, and freedom, and again, sort of responsibility with that on building what they fundamentally like building. And instead of sort of breaking it down by like, hey, here are some folks that do support, here are some folks that do sort of marketing, or here are some folks that do actual sort of like product design or whatever, why not just do the whole thing together? So on one hand, it might seem strange that you're talking to the same set of people for everything that we do. Like if you email us, it'll just be us. There isn't like another team. It's just us. But on the other side, it's been incredibly empowering for each one of us. It's also been a lot of fun. But I think one of my favorite things about this whole experience has been that it gives us so much context on what we're building and what we're making. Just the fact that we're in there in the community talking to all of you, getting all of that feedback, and then going back and building it, as opposed to getting that sort of second hand from somebody else. Like if I was to give you an example, imagine you're an engineer at a company and you're working on the product, but sort of the product decisions or like the sort of feedback from customers is coming through somebody else or a different department or a different team at the company. You're getting secondhand information, and in this case, what we want to do is we'd want you as the person sort of building the thing should be getting or feeling the pain as directly as possible. If not yourself, then directly through a user that you're talking to or that you're on Zoom with. Anyway, it might seem a little unrelated, but I just wanted to just over time share a little bit more about us. If that sort of sounds interesting to you, or if you've got questions about that, I'd love to sort of talk to you further. Again, you can pop them in here, you can pop them in Discord, and or if you're interested in sort of learning more about the team and potentially joining us at some point, we're always around. Feel free to reach out at any point. With that, let me bring Dax back on. Let's do a little bit of a Q&A. I see somebody's got a lot of questions. Abraham there. I hope those get typed out soon. But yeah, we'll try and go with things. We'll try and go with some of the questions here. Dax, what I'm going to do is I think I'll go through some of them. I'll lob it up to you, and then maybe you can take a stab at them.
Yeah, sounds good.
Let's start with, I think, the first one. I think we had one from before, and this was maybe not touched on as much as so what's the deal with React as a front end? Like I've seen this question asked before because we've used this in our notes app, in the guide that we've built. Why is it React? Like, what are we like stuck to it? What's the deal with it? And what's the sort of role of the front end in the ideal stack or in Create SST?
Yeah, I think we have to figure out how to message this properly. We are a full stack framework in that we help you build a full backend and help you connect to your front end. But we're not building a front end framework. We're not opinionated about the front end framework. We're not tied to it. We'll help you connect your front end to your backend in a type safe way. So today, because it just is the most popular, we are shipping a React front end with it. And we spent the time in figuring out the right way to connect everything and in a way that scales and is fun to work with. But we want to do this for every other framework that is, reasonably popular. So for Vue, for Solid, like for everything that we can find. So you have a good starting point no matter what framework you choose. If there are frameworks that we didn't get to, like you can do that yourself. There's really no coupling of SST and the front end. So I consider ourselves a full stack framework because we're helping you ship a full stack application, but none of our architecture is really dependent on a specific front end. So I don't actually use React for my own projects. I use Solid, and we're going to be releasing like a Solid Start construct eventually as well to deploy like an edge rendered Solid Start setup. I think we have a great person from our community, Sean, and he's putting together a remix construct for like the best remix deployment on AWS. So we're going to support everything. It's not a lot of work for us. It's a little bit of initial work to figure out, okay, how does this thing work? But from there, like the community that uses it helps us tweak it from there.
Yeah. It makes sense. Just going through some of the messages here, there are a couple of shout outs. Shout out to Kevin for spotting an error with the Learn guide there. Thanks, Devin. That's a nice message on betting on SST. It's just thinking about the developer experience in the community is obviously a big deal for us. And I think somebody had a question about, so this had come up, I think, with the chat that you had with Tyler, but Tyler had mentioned the talk that Rick had given, or this was a part of the reInvent. I'm sure somebody can sort of drop a link to that, but maybe you can just expand on that really quickly so that people have a little more context on what that was.
The Rick Houlihan talk. I'm not sure if I watched it, so I don't think that I remember exactly. I watch a bunch of his stuff, but I mean, I can speak to what I assume he talked about it, and it is. I think people use Dynamo, and there's a natural way to use it when you're coming from a relational database where you create a table per entity and you create in your Stacks code all the different fields that each entity has, etc. But you run into some problems when entities depend on each other and you ask questions of the database that span multiple entities. And I think single table design seems really crazy and really weird at first. It feels like you're doing this really weird setup inside Dynamo, but it turns out to be a very excellent way to model things. And like I mentioned, ElectroDB is helpful in implementing that.
Yeah. We also had a couple of comments or I guess sort of questions about the end-to-end samples. Yeah, we don't have a ton for them, but that is definitely something that we're working on. I would like to get that out at some point. There was a shout out on type safety and how these libraries have been sort of amazing. And I think that's been a sort of key focus here. I think Dax, you sort of talked about it already, but if you had something else to say, that would be cool.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of libraries out there, but a really small handful of them are, as you heard from the authors of both of these libraries, they're really committed to a certain experience. And we're trying to find every single one of them and try to integrate it or recommend it with SST. So far we have Pothos, we have ElectroDB, we have Kaisley. These are like the 3 best TypeScript libraries that I have ever seen. And we're hoping that they inspire a lot more.
Yeah, I think Jeff had a question, and this sounds like, so this was Dax, I'm not sure you've seen this one, but this was about TypeScript, and it sounds like Jeff is thinking about getting into TypeScript, and he's comparing it to Rust and Go, right? So the real question here is like, should I invest time in TypeScript if I don't know it now?
Yeah, so as a few thoughts around this. First, you probably have no option because on some end, at some point, you're going to build, if you're building a web application, you're going to be building a front end, and that likely is going to be in TypeScript. So you're kind of automatically going to get better at it if you do full stack development. The second thing is, yes, like in certain benchmarks, Rust and Go are more powerful, like more efficient, etc. And I'm actually new to using TypeScript on the back end. I think prior to joining SST, I don't ever think I really deployed a backend TypeScript or Node service. I spent a lot of time with Go. I spent a lot of time with Elixir. The thing I'll say on that is efficiency, performance, all of this usually comes from architecture. It usually doesn't really come from your language. Of course, if you're building something very specific that benefits from the certain things that that Go and Rust are good at, you're going to get much better performance. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by architecture. If you have a traditional setup, like a Go application, you're deploying in a container, which I would imagine most people using Go are deploying it in a container. That container is running all day, and no matter how many requests it's getting, whether it's getting a bunch of requests during the day, no requests at night, it is running all the time. So if you talk about power usage, that's a lot more than a serverless architecture where your Lambda function and most of your architecture doesn't really exist except for the moment it's being used. So if you compare like the efficiency between like a traditional like a container-based architecture and a serverless architecture, the language choice ends up not really mattering at all. There's like a 99% boost on just switching to serverless, and you have a lot to play with in terms of whether your language is as fast as possible or not. And the third thing I want to say is I think in the next few years we're going to be really shocked at how fast JavaScript can actually be. There are a lot of new projects that are re-implementing the runtime, or at least parts of the runtime. So we have Dino, which is already like beating Node in a lot of benchmarks, and then we have Bun, which I think a lot of benchmarks are already beating both Dino and Node. And those are just normal JavaScript engines. They're just re-implemented with like a lot of attention on performance. So I think it's worth investing in. I think it is one of the best. Maybe not best is not the right word, but TypeScript has one of the most accessible but powerful type systems. You don't have to like go crazy like learning Haskell or anything, but you still get some of those benefits. And it's pretty performant, and will continue to get more performant over the next couple of years.
Cool. Yeah. No, that was pretty helpful. By the way, I think we posted the link to Rick's talk from YouTube. So if somebody wanted to sort of watch that, that's definitely there. There's thanks for the shout out on the on how we're sort of thinking about building out the team. Devin had a bit, and I think there are a couple of things that people are catching that maybe are failing that we'll definitely jump on right away. Devin had a little bit about, or he had a question about how long until the release of auth. I know from chat that you're maybe not too thrilled with Cognito. I wanted to give this question to you partly because this is kind of the sort of similar pattern is what happened with our previous event, where your talk was a bit of a preview to what we were going to release next. And obviously we already just talked about we mentioned the auth thing, but it might be helpful if you took a couple of minutes to give maybe a sneak peek on what the sort of thinking is around auth, and maybe like queue up what our next sort of event is going to be about as well.
Yeah. So the question was how long to release of auth. Maybe you're not too thrilled with Cognito. So this kind of goes back to the beginning where I was saying it's hard to figure out what AWS services you should and should not use until you've actually used them. I think with our experience with Cognito and plus the issues that people bring up, of course it can work and there's really no obvious problem with using it. The question is it like the best possible auth service or auth solution you can have in your system? We don't think it is, and we think there's a pretty big gap between something fairly minimal we can do and the Cognito experience today. So we are planning on releasing, I don't know if it's going to be a full construct. I think it's likely going to be some new options on the API construct that turn on auth that you can specify, like the usual stuff, like I want to auth with GitHub, with Facebook, with Google, whatever you want to auth with. And we'll provide a callback that you can handle, which gives you an authenticated user. And then from there, you can handle how you want to store them, how you want to manage their session, all the things like that. We looked at a bunch of different third-party auth providers to see, okay, what are the great patterns that we have? Like, so Cognito goes on the extreme of trying to do everything for you, including storing your users and their attributes and all kinds of stuff. And then you have stuff on the other side of the spectrum, like WorkOS, which I think is probably what we're most inspired by. So WorkOS helps you implement single sign-on for your application, and it's very minimal, really clean API, and it basically does all the annoying work for you, and you can still do all the parts that are specific to your application. So we're trying to replicate something similar to that. I think we have clarity mostly in what we want to build. I'm probably going to start working on it, the actual implementation, towards the end of this week. I don't know about the timeline. I don't think it's going to take. We're hoping we can do another one of these events in a month or so.
Yeah, that's roughly what we're looking at. But the big sort of thing for us is that's been a key part of our focus. And again, it's just a pain point that almost everybody faces every single day. Just running along with the questions here, I think I see kind of a neat little comment on just trying out create SSD. Would be nice to have an option for not having some parts like the front end or database instead of having to remove or delete them later. Yep, that's we actually just we literally talked about that I think yesterday.
Yeah.
So that
we actually have, if you do create SSD -- minimal, or if you do the -- help, it'll show you how to do it. There are actually minimal versions of, pretty much has most of what's in there. It won't have like the full GraphQL setup and the front end setup, but if you're looking to start off with a more bare bones approach, like you can use that.
Yeah. And I think as we add some other options, we'll also probably have an option of like, hey, don't put in any front end. I just want to roll out my own.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Dax, any recommendations on NeoVim plugins? I recall, I think Dax is going to do a stream about that one at some point.
Yeah, I think one of these weeks I'm not going to be able to come up with a good topic that's SSD related, so I might just do a NeoVim stream. I can link it in the Discord later, but I have my configuration on my GitHub. I'm not like a NeoVim power user by any means, so I feel kind of weird you taking my config, I feel like you should go find, like, there's people that do really crazy stuff that might be better to look at, but I will link my config.
Glenn had a shout out on the way we're building our team. Thanks for that. The single table approaches towards the end, but the entire talk is definitely worth a listen. Yeah, this is talking about Rick's talk that we posted. Yeah, somebody's got a shout out on adopting SST and how their team has been very happy with it. How I wish Create SST was released earlier. How I wish we had released it earlier as well. Yeah, and then somebody's got, can I send all my questions over email? The best thing for this really is Discord, and it's not just us. And one of the reasons I'd want to sort of plug Discord and previously Slack is, in a lot of cases when you post your questions, obviously we're going to answer them, but what's been surprising to me and the rest of our team as well is that a lot of times we'll get somebody from the community jump in and give an answer that was probably better than what we would have given. And it gives us a chance to sort of learn from them and then sort of reach out to them and talk to them. And so, the email is obviously it works to a certain extent. In many cases, I might reply to the email. I might just sort of redirect you to Discord, but just going out in the community is just far better. And we track it as well. So we try and make sure nothing sort of slips through the cracks. But yeah, I think that's about all the questions we have, at least in YouTube. Dax, are you seeing anything else? Is that it?
No, I think that's everything.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think we should be good. Again, thanks to everybody for coming in, joining us. We already dropped some hints on what we're working on next and what we'll have moving forward. But yeah, that should be it on our end, and hope you guys have a nice day.
See you, everyone.
See you guys.